afternoon.
On va reprendre les pitchs, donc vous pouvez venir vous asseoir si vous souhaitez assister au pitch. Merci.
Thank you very much. This will be in English today. My name is Vincent Warren. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights based in the United States. And today I bring you in uncharacteristic American humility a call for you to support Black love, Black joy, and Black happiness. When I was in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, I was with a bunch of organizers in America who had been protesting and organizing in Ferguson for the killing of Michael Brown. And when I got there, that protest had been going on for a month, for an entire month. And I was invited in as an older person to talk with them about civil rights, human rights, and what lawyers could do to support their struggle. But I met a young man who was 15 years old, and he was very angry with me. We had never met, but he was furious. And he said to me, as I was talking about what strategies we could deploy around police killings of Black people in Ferguson, he said to me, "I'm upset with you." And I said, "Why are you upset with me? We've never met." And he said, "Because your generation was supposed to have fixed this already. And here I am as a 15-year-old living in Ferguson, Missouri. The police are trying to kill us. They're destroying our neighborhoods. They're calling us criminals. And you lawyers were supposed to have done something about this." And I thought about it for a while. And I thought, yes, he's right. Things in the United States are still terrible. Black people are still the most likely to go to prison, the most likely to stay in prison, the most likely to put in solitary confinement, and the most likely to be executed in the United States. Black people are the least likely to go to college, the least likely to stay in college, the least likely to receive health care, the least likely to be hired for good jobs, and the least likely to be free from state control. And I thought, he's right. What have we done? And as we think about what has happened in the Black experience over the last 60 years, we find that the United States government's penchant and desire for war not only has infiltrated our foreign policy, but it has been a mainstay in domestic policy as well. So in the 1960s, the War on Poverty, which was a federal program that was supposed to support Black people in poverty, didn't do that. Over the last 60 years, the program has been eliminated, and the pieces that remain have been converted to an oppressive regime of social control for Black lives. In the 1980s, there was the War on Drugs. The War on Drugs was supposed to eliminate from society the horrible effects of drug use and drug trafficking on Black communities. But it didn't do that. It did the opposite. Because of the war on drugs, we've seen a massive increase in incarceration and jailing and putting in cages of Black people. We've seen Black communities totally destroyed because of police presence and because of drug and jail policies. And it is the #1 driver of mass incarceration today. In the 2000s, we had the War on Terror. And the War on Terror was supposed to eliminate the threat of terrorism on American soil. Did it do that? It did not. What did it do? Over the last 20 years, this so-called War on Terror created a powerful surveillance state within the United States. It criminalized Muslim lives, it criminalized Arab lives, it criminalized South Asian lives, and communities and added a sweeping domestic militarism regime in the United States that only reinforced the worst elements and the worst impacts of both the war on poverty and the war on terror. We learned that the war on terror was actually not a foreign policy initiative the way that it played out, but it was an initiative that was a domestic social initiative that supported military aggression at home, particularly in black communities. So it is no wonder that that young man who was 15 years old at the time was angry with me, because I told him that the human rights framework was going to protect him, and it did not. And then Ferguson happened. In the meetings and the work that I did and my colleagues did at the Center for Constitutional Rights at Ferguson, I actually noticed something very different about some of the engagements with organizers and with activists, different than I had witnessed in the previous 30 years. The activists and the organizers that were running the meeting and creating strategies against state oppression were not my age. They were younger. They were not men. They were women. They were queer. They came to this work with a very deep political sense and a knowledge of internationalism, a sense of how struggles like the one that was happening in Ferguson have happened in many countries around the world and continue to happen. They were armed with a deep sense of the colonial project that has been happening in the United States ever since the first enslaved people were brought to the United States in 1619. And why that makes a difference is because the civil rights, human rights frame in the United States had largely been one about equality under law. That's how we framed it. That's when I went to law school, that's what I wanted to do, equality under law. It didn't talk about colonialism. It didn't talk about racial capitalism. It didn't talk about all of the mechanisms by which equality and human rights are continually and constantly undermined. And yet, these young people who were not marching with Dr. King in the 1960s, who were not a part of the Black Power movement of the 1970s, they were not part of my law school class in the 1990s, these young people refused to accept that just a framework and good efforts alone were enough. They wanted a political analysis that was put into action. These young students, these young people, were unapologetically black. And for those of us that are here that are not black, that's a framework that maybe you understand, but let me tell you what that means as a black person. Every time that we walk into a space, sometimes even spaces like this one, where we feel that we have to apologize for the black failures that have led us to this particular moment. We have to apologize in court for having plaintiffs and people who don't come from crystal clear, beautiful lives. They have their problems, and we say to the courts, ignore those problems and focus on the issues at hand. Our entire civil rights and human rights framework as black people up into this point has been framed around the idea that black people are imperfect, that black people are problematic, that black people, some black people, cause some of the problems that other black people are trying to fix. And this current group of activists and organizers in the United States reject that. They say black people have nothing to apologize for. If we are being incarcerated as we are at a higher rate than anybody else, it is not because we are criminals. It is because we have been criminalized. If we are losing our children to the state through child separation because the state says black people are not good parents, it is not because we are not good parents. It's because the entire social safety net that everybody else has and relies on doesn't work for black people. When I ask myself, what is the essence of this particular movement that is different from others, what I'm reminded of is the idea that being unapologetically black doesn't mean that we are aiming in the human rights community just for the survival of black people. We are aiming for the survival. We are aiming for the thriving of black people. And so I come to you today in very uncharacteristic American humility to ask you to support black love, black happiness, and black thriving. The movement for Black Lives created an extraordinary manifesto. I don't know if you've seen it, but it is available on the web at m4bl.org. And the manifesto from these young organizers doesn't just talk about black equality. It talks about black liberation. And black people, it says, cannot be liberated until all of our people are liberated. So in it, just to give you two examples, there is a platform around solidarity with indigenous people in the United States. The movement continues to grow, and it now incorporates calls for things that seem impossible in the context of the United States legal and political sphere. It calls to abolish prisons. It calls to abolish the cages that they put so many black people in. And there is a massive debate in the United States about that. And do you know what the people who are on our side of the debate, the people that say, yes, they shouldn't be put in cages, you know what they say? They say, I agree with you, but abolition, abolishing prisons, what would we do with the bad people? What would we do with the bad people? And the response that my young comrades are giving to them, they say that if you were in the United States and in 1850, when the abolition movement against slavery was happened, would you ask the question that abolition is too much of an ask for the polity, for our politics? Would you ask, what are we going to do with the black people that can't work, that can't get along? Don't we need to have some protective mechanism? This is the challenge and I think the promise of the abolitionist framework. It is hard. It is very, very difficult, but if we are not calling for the total abolition of what keeps us under the thumb of the US government, then we are only calling for support for what the government does for us. Another frame that is really important and that is resonant yet again, not for the first time in the United States, is the framework of reparations. Reparations. And many of us, when we think of reparations, we say, it's impossible, because that's a lot of money. It's not really fair for people now, white people now in the United States that were not involved in slavery, to have to pay the money for enslavement. That's what the conversation is. I was reminded by my colleague, Dominic Renfrey, about the experience in France, right here in France, where it has only been a few years since the government of France has paid back the loans that it took out for the slave trade 200 years ago. Those payments from this government were going to the descendants of enslaved people and banks for 270 years after the slave trade was ended. The payments are still happening. So when we say reparations, how is it that it is not easy to compensate black people and their descendants for the horrors that is done to them, but it is very easy and actually quite normal to be able to pay back the banks for making the loans that allowed slavery to happen? This is what the conversation is now in the United States. It requires divestment, it requires awareness, and it requires political, creating the political will to be able to do what is right. The framework does not anywhere in it, the manifesto that I was telling you about, there are two words that will not appear in that document, and they will surprise you. One of the words that does not appear is equality. Equality does not appear in the document. Another word that does not appear in the document is non-discrimination. And what this does is, from my perspective, for those of us that are in the human rights field, that have been thinking about and working very hard to secure equality and to make sure that states do not discriminate, it might feel that the Black Lives Matter framework is not completely in sync with the human rights framework. But in fact, the opposite is true. That the Black Lives Matter movements, the youth that are here from FIDH, everyone that is outside that has not gone through the same challenges that we have and are coming to this work are calling for something different, just like that 15-year-old asked me to do something different. And the reason why I think that equality and non-discrimination are not used is because in the history of the United States, equality means the equal opportunity to compete, which ignores the devastating impacts and the gravitational forces of slavery and the elements that weigh down Black people, including myself, even today. And they don't call for non-discrimination because in the United States context, that is a double-edged sword. It works in two different ways. The non-discrimination frame in the United States doesn't acknowledge white supremacy at all. And in fact, it rather requires that white supremacists and people that are oppressors are not discriminated against in the same breath that they say that people who are oppressed are not discriminated against. The challenge there is that if you don't acknowledge the effects of slavery, the effects of white supremacy, the effects of racialized capitalism in the framework within which we are asking for change, we may be doomed to recreate in a different guise the challenges that we are fighting. So they call for transformation, and this call is powerful. And it reconnects, it resonates in the United States. And I can give you a couple of examples of why this is a trend that I think is worth investing in. Prior to 2020, when the killings were happening, George Floyd, which you all know, prior to that, the protests around police violence was organized by Black people, attended by Black people. Black people were arrested at them, and then Black people were criminalized and vilified by the state for doing that, talking about violence, talking about all sorts of things. After George Floyd was murdered, we saw something different. We are seeing that protests against police violence are being organized by Black and white people. We are seeing that white people are getting arrested. And in an echo of the strategy of the 1960s civil rights movement, when white people get arrested at protests, they don't get vilified. That the state stands up and notices. And this has all been part of a strategy from the movement for Black lives. So this didn't happen by accident. Joe Biden, who's the first president of the United States to use the word white supremacy in a speech, and the UN Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination just a few months ago framed their engagement with civil society in the US context, in the context of George Floyd's murder and protest and the uprisings. And because of that framework and because of the testimony, for the first time, the UN Committee Against Discrimination has urged the United States to adopt a reparations framework, We have a lot of work to do, but these are just examples of how civil society, and particularly a solidaristic civil society that is focused not on the technicalities of the work that we very often do in courts and bodies, but are actually focused on the deepest suffering of the people and a demand to refuse to even let us reframe that discussion into a technical one. And they demand that human suffering must have a commensurate response. And that response cannot be another working group. That response cannot be another study. I know we all work on reports. We all do. But it can't just be another report. We can say one thing, perhaps, about the connection between the laws of physics and the work that we do as human rights defenders. And the thing that we might say is that the third law, Newton's third law of physics, is that for every force, there is an equal and opposite force. And you all know what that looks like in your work when you are demanding rights, when you are resisting, when you're calling for affirmative measures, that the state and the state apparatus has a very swift backlash. What do? They bring out the guns, they bring out the tanks, they raid our homes, they arrest us. They come for our leaders, they come for our leaders' families, they come for our colleagues, many of whom have been remembered at this wonderful event continuously. They come for the journalists, they come for the lawyers, they come for the priests, they shut down our NGOs, and they target the entire apparatus that we have spent time building to be able to defend rights and expand them. That's what they do. We all know this to be true. I want to offer in my few remaining minutes a framework that we at the Center for Constitutional Rights have found useful, and that I know that you all do, but we need to think about these things together. So if you have an activist and a lawyer and a storyteller, you can change the world. An activist, a lawyer, and a storyteller. And if you're doing it right, you might not even need the lawyer. An activist can apply the political and social pressure to the powers that we are fighting and the powers that hold us back. Black Lives Matter is made up of a new generation of youth that have lived in targeted communities all of their lives. They can organize and bring to the surface the wisdom of the communities that are under siege. They do not need us to tell them what their suffering looks like. If they need us at all, they need us to tell the powers that we are connected to that power needs to listen to those communities. We translate a lot in our work. We translate into different languages. We translate into formalistic ways, in ways that the bureaucracy that is the power structure can understand. When we do that, we should be thinking, have we lost the message that our people that brought us here, if they were here, what would they say? That's the thing that we should be saying. So you need the activists to be able to shift that dialogue, and which brings me to the lawyers. And amongst the groups of people that are here, we lawyers are the worst in translating what is actually happening to courts, because we think our role is to create a technical argument that will convince the most conservative judge to do the least harmful thing for our people. And practically, we all know that this is true. We must at least do that. But is that all we should be doing? No, what we should be doing is practicing what we call movement lawyering. And it's the idea to have lawyers connected to, as much as possible, the social movements and the community groups that are being harmed. And when I say connected to, I don't mean connected to that we fly in, we say, we've thought about it, here's the legal theory, here are your options, and then we fly out and we go argue it. What I mean is think about your communities, the communities that you work so closely with. Where do they meet? Do they meet in somebody's house? Do they meet in a community center? Do they meet in a church or a religious basement? Are they not able to meet and they're scattered and they have to only talk on Signal? But wherever that is, wherever people are meeting, the lawyers should ask and only go in if they're invited, and then not say anything. This is very controversial for lawyers. Have you ever met a lawyer that doesn't talk? No. What I mean is when we went to Ferguson, we sat with the organizers for 1 month and we asked one question. Based upon your strategy, what do you need us to do? And what they came up with was surprising. They didn't need us to file a big lawsuit. They actually didn't need us to get particular people out of jail. They said, you can't stop us from getting arrested because part of our strategy is to get arrested. But the problem is when they arrest us, they will take us to different jails in different parts of the state, and then people cannot come back to the protest. And if people stop coming back to the protests, that means the national cameras are going to go away, and this will not be happening. So what we need you as lawyers to do is to organize a network of lawyers that can be at the various jail sites to be able to get people released, they can get medical attention, and then to be able to escort them back to the site of the protest. And so that was our role. It didn't make any headlines. We didn't inform FIDH about it. We didn't inform any of you about it because our strategy was not to make us the heroes, but it was to be in service to the thing that the organizers needed. And that movement lawyering, connecting with movement lawyering, even going against your instinct as a lawyer, can be a very valuable tool in addition to the extraordinary work that the lawyers in this room do in a very technical manner. In closing, I want to talk about storytelling. A storyteller is the most important aspect of this work because these are the journalists, these are the poets, these are the people that keep alive the oral traditions in the communities. These are the cultural workers, these are the writers, the filmmakers, the documentarians, because they are the ones that will be telling the story that impacts people the most to the public and to the power and decision makers. And so to think about cultural work and journalism as something separate from activism and lawyering is a mistake. Because these stories that we are privileged enough to hear from our communities, they're precious, and they need to be brought to life in any way possible so that the hearts and the minds and the way that the only way to be able to shift through a bureaucracy is to get someone in power that goes home and tells their family about what happened, and their family says, I cannot believe that you are allowing this to happen. That's how it changes. And that is through the power of storytelling. So yes, with an activist, a lawyer, and a storyteller, we can change the world in our work. And to this 15-year-old who is now in his 20s, I've lost touch with him, but I've never forgotten him. And I have, since that moment, asked myself the following question when I think about the work that we're going to do. I say, not what do I think, not my children, not my children's children, but the children of my children of my children. When they look back on what we are doing right now, when your children's children look back on the work that they are doing right now, what are they the most proud of? What can they say that my people did this extraordinary thing? And that should be what guides us, as hard as it is through all of the things that we're dealing with. And then when we look back to your ancestors, way back, you don't even know who they are because they weren't writing about it back then. Those people, they're still with us. They're with us in this room. What are they the most proud of that you were doing? Because you and I were their best hope for human rights. And that's the framework that we should be talking about. And so I bring to you great tidings and come to you with uncharacteristic American humility to ask for your support of not reform, not non-discrimination. I want to see black joy. I want our communities to not just live in freedom and freedom from and freedom to. Those are important things. But what does it feel like for black people to be in complete and total joy in a country that 400 years ago brought them here in chains? So in our 400th year of struggle, I couldn't be happier to be here at FIDH and to be able to share this story with you. Thank you very much.